Well, it's 6 o'clock, so we'll get started. My name's Jay Wimpy. I'm the current president of the American Civil Defense Association. This is our monthly meeting. We're going to be discussing infrastructure vulnerabilities. We have a little disclaimer here that I'll read to you. Nothing in this presentation should be considered legal, medical, or financial advice. The opinions of the viewers can differ considerably and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of TACDA. You should always do your own research and consult with professionals before making decisions. The format tonight is informal. We would like to allow questions on the fly so that answers will be in context. Feel free to use the chat feature, and we will do our best to get those questions answered as they come up. We'll be answering those kind of on the fly. Well, as we go along, I'll try to keep up with anything you want to put in the chat questions or comments. And other than that, you can interrupt us. In order to talk to us, you need to unmute your mic, and then we'll be able to hear you. Our presenter tonight is Paul Seyfried. He's been working on preparedness hard and heavy for many decades, and I first ran into him in 1988, I believe, and he's been a great resource, and he studied this question a lot. I've done a lot of reading on it, and so we'll go ahead and let him discuss the situation with our infrastructure and discuss maybe the importance and how that's going to possibly affect you in the future. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll turn the time over to you, Paul Seyfried.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I do a lot of reading from the Commission to Assess the Threat of EMP to the United States, or otherwise known as the EMP Commission. I am going to use a lot of material tonight from this document, which you can read in its entirety on the internet. It's the executive summary. So you can look for EMP Commission executive summary. Critical national infrastructures. I'm going to hold that up so you can get a good look at it. So, by the way, this meeting tonight is brought to you by electricity, which we depend on for everything that keeps us alive. I hate to just read from a document, but I think it's important that I review this certain portions of this document that I've selected for tonight so that I don't get anything out of context. But this kind of gives you an idea of what's contained in this document that I hope you'll find time to read sometime. So the preface starts, the physical and social fabric of the United States is sustained by a system of systems, a complex and dynamic network of interlocking and interdependent infrastructures whose harmonious functioning enables the myriad actions, transactions, and information flow that undergird the orderly conduct of civil society in this country. The vulnerability of these infrastructures to threats, deliberate, accidental, and acts of nature, is the focus of greatly heightened concern in the current era, a process accelerated by the events of 9/11 and recent hurricanes, including Katrina and Rita. This report represents the results of the Commission's assessment of the effects of a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse attack on our critical national infrastructures and provides recommendations for their mitigation. The assessment is informed by analytic and test activities executed under Commission sponsorship, which are discussed in this volume. The electromagnetic pulse generated by a high-altitude nuclear explosion is one of a small number of threats that can hold our society at risk of catastrophic consequences. Included in this would be cyber attack, or it would be deliberate physical attack by domestic or foreign terrorist actors, physically destroying substations and other critical components of the grid, which for some reason we leave sitting right out in plain sight where anybody can molest it at will. So we're not thinking about only EMP in this context. I'm aware of a substation in northern Utah that, if vandalized by people who know what they're doing, would knock out the power for 7 states surrounding Utah. So that's just an example of what a small handful of bad actors could do to our critical infrastructure. The increasingly pervasive use of electronics of all forms represents the greatest source of vulnerability to attack by EMP. Electronics are used to control, communicate, compute, store, manage, and implement nearly every aspect of United States civilian systems. When a nuclear explosion occurs at high altitude, the EMP signal it produces will cover the wide geographic region within the line of sight of the detonation. This broadband, high-amplitude EMP, when coupled into sensitive electronics, has the capability to produce widespread and long-lasting disruption and damage to the critical infrastructure that underpin the fabric of U.S. society. Because of the ubiquitous dependence of U.S. society on the electrical power system, its vulnerability to an EMP attack, coupled with the EMP's particular damage mechanisms, creates the possibility of long-term catastrophic consequences. The implicit invitation to take advantage of this vulnerability, when coupled with increasing proliferation of nuclear weapons and their delivery systems, is a serious concern. A single EMP attack may seriously degrade or shut down a large part of the electric power grid in the geographic area of EMP exposure effectively, instantaneously. There is also a possibility of functional collapse of grids beyond the exposed area as electrical effects propagate from one region to another. In other words, if somebody did a lower altitude attack, say 100 kilometers above the earth, over the Ohio Valley, it would knock out all of the Ohio Valley, but the effects from that attack and the failure of the eastern grid will easily cascade over into the western grid and cause widespread disruptions there. The time required for full recovery of service would depend on both the disruption and damage to the electrical power infrastructure and to other national infrastructures. Larger affected areas and stronger EMP field strength will prolong the time to recover. Some critical electrical power infrastructure components are no longer manufactured in the United States, and their acquisition ordinarily requires from 1 to 3 years lead time in routine circumstances. Damage to or loss of these components would leave significant parts of the electrical infrastructure out of service for a period measured in months to a year or more. There is a point in time in which the shortage or exhaustion of sustaining backup systems, including emergency power supplies, batteries, standby fuel supplies, communications, and manpower resources that can be mobilized, coordinated, and dispatched, together lead to a continuing degradation of critical infrastructure for a prolonged period of time. Electrical power is necessary to support other critical infrastructures, including supply and distribution of water, food, fuel, communications, transport, financial transactions, emergency services, government services, and all other infrastructures supporting the national economy and welfare. Should significant parts of the electrical power infrastructure be lost for any substantial period of time, the Commission believes that the consequences are likely to be catastrophic, and many people may ultimately die for lack of the basic elements necessary to sustain life in dense urban and suburban communities. In fact, the Commission is deeply concerned that such impacts are likely in the event of an EMP attack unless practical steps are taken to provide protection for crucial elements of the electric system and for rapid restoration of electric power, particularly to essential services. The recovery plans for the individual infrastructures currently in place essentially assume, at worst, limited upsets to the other infrastructures that are important to their operation. Such plans may be of little or no value in the wake of an EMP attack because of its long duration effects on all infrastructures that rely on electricity or electronics. The ability to recover from this situation in an area is of great concern. The use of automated control systems has allowed many companies and agencies to operate effectively with smaller workforces. Thus, while manual control of some systems may be possible, the number of people knowledgeable enough to support manual operations is limited. Repair of physical damage is also constrained by a small workforce. Many maintenance crews are sized to perform routine and preventive maintenance of high reliability equipment. When repair or replacement is required that exceeds routine levels, arrangements are typically in place to augment crews from outside the affected area. However, due to the simultaneous far-reaching effects from EMP, the anticipated augmenters likely will be occupied in their own areas. Thus, repair normally requiring weeks of effort may require a much longer time than planned. The consequences of an EMP event should be prepared for and protected against to the extent it is reasonably possible. Cold War-style deterrence through mutual assured destruction is not likely to be an effective threat against potential protagonists that are either failing states or transnational groups, say North Korea, for example. Therefore, making preparations to manage the effects of an EMP attack, including understanding what has happened, maintaining situational awareness, having plans in place to recover, challenging and exercising those plans, and reducing vulnerabilities is critical to reducing the consequences and thus probability of attack. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and talk about what's called a Scada system. A Scada system, Scada is an acronym that stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. And I don't seem to have a picture of a Scada box right now, but it's basically a small, relatively small shielded box that contains electronic components in it. And it has connectors that go to various data cables that go out and spread all over the place. And they either gather information, monitor the functions of other outlying components of a system, or even other power plants. Or it basically acts like a management system for many other systems, and they are packed with sensitive electronics. And these are particularly vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse upset or damage. Some of the testing I've seen done by the laboratory suggests that they're damaged with a electric field as weak as 3,000 to 6,000 volts per square meter. We know from our own upper atmospheric testing that EMP energy fields can be anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 volts per square meter. And these Scada systems are embedded widely all over the United States by the hundreds of thousands in the power lines, in the telecommunication systems, in the cell systems. On my own production line at work in a pharmaceutical company, there are Scada systems embedded everywhere along the production line. They're all connected to the grid, and the grid will harvest this EMP energy and drag that pulse into every component connected to it. So you can add hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of these Scada units that have to be manufactured and replaced all over the country for the system to work. Let me proceed in the summary here. Demoralization and deterioration of social order can be expected to deepen if a water shortage is protracted. Anarchy will certainly loom if government cannot supply the population with enough water to preserve health and life. Many homeowners with private wells also would face similar problems. There would be fewer workarounds to get their pumps operating again if the pump controller is damaged or inoperable, not to mention not having any power, I might add. Even if power is restored, it is unlikely the average homeowner would technically be competent to bypass a failed pump controller and figure out how to power the pump with bypass power lines. The pump itself may be damaged by the pulse effects that are dragged all the way down to the pump motor by the power line. The first priority would be meeting personal water needs. Federal, state, and local governments do not have the collective capability, if the water infrastructure fails over a large area, to supply enough water to the civilian population to preserve life. Storm-induced blackouts of the electric grid have demonstrated that in the absence of electric power, the water infrastructure will fail. Storm-induced blackouts have also demonstrated that even in the face of merely local and small-scale failure of the water infrastructure, the combined efforts of government agencies at all levels are hard-pressed to help. For example, in Katrina, August of 2005, collapsed the water infrastructure in New Orleans and coastal Louisiana. The Katrina-induced blackout stopped the vast machinery for purifying and delivering water to the population. Water supplies were contaminated. The National Guard, among other resources, had to be mobilized to rush water and mobile water purification systems to the afflicted area. The water crisis, which was protracted because the blackout was protracted, the electric power grid requiring weeks and in some places months to repair, was a major contributing factor to the mass evacuation of the regional population. Once evacuated, many never returned. Thus, the loss of water resources was a significant factor contributing to the permanently reducing of the population in the region. The effects of Katrina on the water infrastructure are comparable to what can be expected to a small EMP attack. Hurricane Lily in October 2002 blacked out the power grid in coastal Louisiana. With no electricity, water pumps no longer worked, depriving the population of running water. Local bottled water supplies were quickly exhausted. Federal and state authorities resorting to using roadside parking lots and tanker trucks as water distribution centers. September 1999, Hurricane Floyd blacked out electricity, causing water treatment and sewage plants to fail in some Virginia localities, and most notably in Baltimore, Maryland. For several days, blackout-induced failure of Baltimore's Hampton sewage facility raised concerns about public health. With its 3 pumps inoperable, Hamden spilled 24 million gallons of waste into Baltimore's Jones Falls waterway and the Inner Harbor. An ice storm in January 1999 blacked out Canada's Ontario and Quebec provinces, causing an immediate and life-threatening emergency in Montreal's water supply, which depends on electricity for filtration and pumping. On January 9th, the 2 water treatment plants that served 1.5 million people in the Montreal region failed, leaving the area with only enough water to last 4 to 8 hours. Government officials kept the water crisis secret, fearing public knowledge would exacerbate the crisis by water hoarding and panic. But as household water pipes went dry and reports of water shortage spread, hoarding happened anyway, and bottled water disappeared from shelves in hours. Warnings not to drink water without boiling it proved pointless because people had no other way of getting water and no way to boil it in the midwinter blackout. Montreal officials feared not only a shortage of drinking water, but also an inadequate supply of water for fighting fires. The Montreal Fire Department prepared to fight fires with a demolition crane instead of water, hoping that if the building caught fire, the conflagration might be contained by demolishing surrounding buildings. So desperate was the situation that provincial officials considered evacuating the city. Fortunately, Hydro-Quebec, the government's electric utility, managed to restore power to filtration plants and restore water service before such extreme measures became necessary. In August 96, a heat wave blacked out parts of southwestern United States. Water supplies were interrupted in some regions because electric pumps would not work. Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, Nevada, Texas, and Idaho experienced blackout-induced disruption in water service during the heat wave. In Fresno, where most of the city received water from wells powered by electric pumps, the city manager declared an emergency. Only 2 of the city's 16 fire stations had water, and most of the fire hydrants were dry. Tankers were rushed in to supplement the fire department's water supply. In all the examples cited, timely emergency services to provide water prevented loss of life from dehydration. However, had the outages lasted longer and the blacked out areas been larger, the outcome would have been very different. Storms are merely suggestive of and provide some basis for extrapolating the greater destructive effects on water infrastructure likely from an EMP attack. Storm-induced blackouts and their effects on the water infrastructure are an imperfect analogy to EMP attack. Taken at face value, storm-induced blackouts and their consequences for the water infrastructure grossly understate the threat posed by an EMP attack. Storms are much more limited in geographic scope compared to an EMP attack. Power grid and water infrastructure recovery from storms compared to recovery from an EMP attack is likely to happen more quickly because of the edge effect, the capability of neighboring localities and states to provide recovery assistance. Because an EMP attack is likely to damage or disrupt electronics over a much wider geographic area than a storm-induced blackout, rescuers from neighboring states and localities would face a much bigger job, and the recovery of water infrastructure would take a much longer time. Nor do storm-induced blackouts replicate the damage from an EMP attack that may occur in small-scale electronic systems critical to the operation of the water infrastructure, such as electric pumps, Scadas, and motor controls for filters and valves. Compared to storms, an EMP attack is likely to inflict not only more widespread damage geographically, but also deeper damage affecting a much broader array of electronic equipment, which will contribute to a much more complicated and protracted period of recovery. High lift and low lift pumps are ubiquitous throughout the infrastructure for purifying, delivering water, and removing wastewater. Water cannot be purified or delivered, nor sewage removed and treated if these systems are damaged or destroyed. Paddle flocculators and other types of mixers are the primary means of chlorination and other chemical purification. If these systems cease functioning, water cannot be purified and likely would remain hazardous. All of these systems depend on the electric grid for power. Large water treatment plants consume so much electricity, in some cases about 100 million watts, that backup generators are impractical. For reliability, the water treatment plants typically draw electricity from 2 local power plants. An EMP attack that collapses the electric power grid will also collapse the water infrastructure. By disrupting the water infrastructure, an EMP attack could pose a major threat to life, industrial activity, and social order. Denial of water can cause death in 3 to 4 days, depending on the climate and level of activity. Stores typically stock enough consumable liquids to supply the normal demands of the local population for 1 to 3 days, although the demand for water and other consumable liquids would greatly increase if tap water were no longer available. Local water supplies would quickly disappear. Resupplying local stores with water would be difficult in the aftermath of an EMP attack that disrupts transportation systems, a likely condition if all critical infrastructures were destroyed. You take a second to consider that the average meal that you consume comes from at least 1,400 miles away and is transported on 7 different diesel-powered trucks. And we're not even talking about freighters at sea that move a lot of food into the United States. So EMP would certainly disrupt operations at the oil refineries and the manufacturing and processing of transportation fuels and the distribution centers that make that fuel available to all the trucking companies and diesel locomotives. So all these systems are very interdependent on each other. And if one major component goes down, they all go down. People are likely to resort to drinking from lakes, streams, ponds, and other sources of surface water. Most surface water, especially in urban areas, is contaminated with waste and pathogens and could cause serious illness if consumed. If water treatment and sewage plants cease operating, the concentration of waste in surface water will certainly increase dramatically and make the risk of consuming surface water more hazardous. One possible consequence of the failure of water treatment and sewage plants could be the release of sludge and other concentrated wastes and pathogens. Typical industrial waste, including cyanide, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and other toxic chemicals. Boiling water for purification would be difficult in the absence of electricity. Even most modern gas stoves require electricity for ignition and cannot be lighted by a match. How's that for engineering? In any event, gas may also not be available to light the stoves. Boiling could be accomplished by open fires fueled by wood or other flammables. Other possible mitigations are handheld pump filters, water purification kits, iodine tablets, or a few drops of household bleach, which we'll talk about in a minute. A prolonged water shortage may lead to a serious consequence. People preoccupied with finding or producing enough drinking water to sustain life would be unavailable to work at normal jobs. Most industrial processes require large quantities of water and would cease if water infrastructures were to fail. I can testify to that because about 3 months ago, a water main that fed the industrial park where I work at a pharmaceutical company ruptured. And they closed down the whole industrial park. They sent the whole first shift down home because there was no way for the staff at the facility to maintain personal hygiene, wash their hands, flush toilets. So you have 200 people in a facility that have no sanitation options, and so they just sent everybody home. Water's pretty cool stuff. Now, near the end of this paragraph, you heard him mention chlorine and iodine for treating drinking water. And I want to get into what we can do as individuals to mitigate that problem. And of course, one of those things is having a generous supply of your own standby drinking water in large containers, hopefully. I like 55-gallon plastic drums. The Red Cross and other organizations have long promoted using chlorine bleach for disinfecting surface water. And we were told for many decades that this kills all of the nasty pathogens and so forth in the water and makes it safe to drink. But as time went on, a bit of clarity has come forward. And now we know that chlorine and iodine do not inactivate cysts and protozoa such as cryptosporidium and giardia. In fact, cryptosporidium and giardia can swim around in straight household bleach for weeks and still not be inactivated. So you have to rely on a little more sophisticated means to treat surface water for personal consumption. I talk to people quite often. In fact, I did yesterday, who would tell me that they have 1,000 gallons of stored water, and so they've got that handled. But I point out that eventually, that 1,000 gallons in an EMP event affecting the national infrastructure, that 1,000 gallons is going to run out. Now you're going to have to start looking for alternative sources of drinking water, and you should have already planned for and obtained the necessary equipment for treating all of the water that you're going to need, not only for drinking for you and every member of your group, but also you need to consider washing dishes, washing clothes, personal hygiene, bathing, showering. So I have long abandoned the standard of 1 gallon per person per day. And I go with like 25 gallons per person per day because I like to shower every day and I like to wash dishes in safe water. I am not going to flush my toilets with surface, contaminated surface water. So I urge people to consider locating local sources of water that you have ready access to, that you can process on a small industrial scale. Now, the emergency preparedness market is saturated with a plethora of emergency water filters. And Jim Phillips, who recently passed away, was a genius at testing and evaluating all these different available emergency water filters. And he would use ditch water to test them, and he would pump substantial quantities of ditch water through these filters to find out how long they lasted before they clogged and became useless. And he also ran tests where they let the processed water from the ditch sit in a petri dish, and then over time they could test that sample and see what eventually started growing in it again. So we could test in reasonable period of time the efficacy of that filter. And it was out of about 15 different filters. I remember a slide he had showed that out of 15 samples, only 2 of them were pathogen free at the end of 10 days. So you need to be very careful about how you choose a emergency water filter, and understand that your emergency water filter is not a long-term solution by any means. We have a property that has enabled us to experiment with water purification on a pretty grand scale. And over time, over years, we've been able to upgrade and improve that system as better equipment was found in the marketplace. Understand that your city uses between 18 and 23 processes to make the surface water that they pull from safe for you to drink. Most, if not all, emergency water filters use 1 or 2 processes. So your urban water source is going to be different than, say, a backpacker's water source, because the backpacker is hiking up in the high Uintas at 10,000 feet, and there are no industrial plants, manufacturing going on. There's no industrial waste being released into the stream. There's no motor fuel and motor oil being washed off the roads and into that natural water source. And so they're not having to deal with the chemical pollutants, the solvents, the fertilizers, the pesticides that are associated with agriculture and animal husbandry. And so the water filter that you are going to need in an urban environment, if you live in a suburban area or an urban area, is going to have to address chemicals, dissolved chemicals in that water source. There's a well-known water filter available by the name of Life Straw. And when they came out, they originally claimed that they could remove viruses from surface water. They have since retreated from that. And so viruses are no longer on the claimed menu of capabilities. But a Life Straw would certainly be better than trying to filter ditch water through a t-shirt or a coffee filter. So it's not a bad idea to have some of those in your kit. But But Straw manufactures a larger emergency filter called the Community. And the Community is supposed to provide safe drinking water from a surface source for up to 105 people for 3 years. So I called the manufacturer, and the question I asked was, when you test this filter for capacity, did you use tap water or did you use ditch water? And they would not answer the question. Eventually, I got them to say that they have to test to NSF standard, National Sanitary Foundation standard 54 and 58. Well, they said they have to test for the removal of chlorine. Well, there's not a lot of chlorine in the Sanpete River. Okay. So that tells me that they're using tap water. So like this Catadine pocket filter that I've relied on for years backpacking, and I've used it many times in lakes and streams at 9, 10,000 feet, and I've never gotten sick using this filter. I learned a lot of things about these little filters, and that is, while they do make lake water safe to drink, as long as nobody's discharging hepatitis or HIV into the stream nearby, they clog pretty quickly. I'd have to clean the filter candle on the filter within 2 quarts. And of course, I can clean the element in the field and repack it and go on pumping water, but about every 3 quarts, the candle would clog to the point where I had to stop and strip the outer layer of the ceramic candle off and then keep going. Well, I can only scrub that ceramic filter candle 300 times before the filter candle has to be replaced. So if you're going to rely on an emergency filter for your family's water needs, that's not going to work. So going back to the Community filter, well, actually, Catadine claims that this water filter will filter up to 13,000 gallons of water. But when pressed, they say that's tap water. And maybe in some locales, tap water needs to be filtered. But in an emergency, you're going to be using water from a murky river or a lake. And you're going to have a long list of pathogens and chemicals that you're going to want to have to take care of. And this filter does nothing for chemicals. It does not stop viruses. I don't know of a single emergency water filter that does a credible job removing viruses. Which brings me to another problem. Where is your water source going to be? Because a lot of people say, well, I know of a great mountain spring, that I go to when I go backpacking. I can always go there. Well, yeah, but it's 80 miles away and it's under 12 feet of snow right now. So you're either going to have to bring the water from where it is to where your gear and your food supplies are, or you're going to have to move all your supplies and your family to where the water source is, because it's not going to come through your faucet anymore. By the way, years ago, when they were developing a new housing development across the highway, the city was a little bit slow in building new water tanks and wells to support the new subdivision. So I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get ready for work, and I jump in the shower and I'm showering away, and I got all lathered up and full of shampoo, and the water stopped coming out of my shower head. and I could hear air coming out of my shower head. Well, fortunately, I had a couple of 2-liter bottles of emergency water under the sink, so I got my two-liter bottles in the shower, and I rinsed all the soap off and went to work. But then it dawned on me, well, about 4 o'clock in the morning, everybody's sprinklers come on, and about 5 o'clock in the morning, everybody else gets up to go to work too. And so while the well is huffing and puffing to pump water into the water tank, it's not keeping up with demand. And so the level in the water tank going down, 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 and the well just can't keep up. And so hence I wound up with shampoo and soap all over me. And so, but that kind of illustrated to me how razor thin the margin is with stored water for a community. Now, a couple of months later, there was another water tank built up the hill, and it cost a couple of $1 million, and 3 new well pumps put in and so forth. But it was just a reminder to me how thin our civilization is when it comes to providing critical services. In about 2000, I had a conversation with Bronius Sakotis, who was a member of the EMP Commission, and his job was conducting laboratory testing, the simulator testing on aircraft, locomotives, diesel trucks, computer systems, television transmitters, all these things that are, motors, all these things that make our society function. And they take them out on an EMP simulator and zap them, and then they'd see what broke. And so, you can imagine Braun with the white coat and the pocket protector with the multicolored pens, that was Braun. So Braun told me that solar panels are inherently invulnerable to the effects of EMP if they are not connected to unshielded wiring. So if you have a solar power system, I hope it's not connected to the power grid. And if you shield the conductors in flexible metal conduit, then the EMP pulse does not see the wire does not see the pulse, and it does not harvest that energy and drag it into your inverter and drag it into your charge controller and wreck those components of your power system. So that's something that you can do on your level that will give you some, usable electricity, provided you have a storage battery system to capture that, so you can use it on demand. But the other thing he told me was, he said, the cities will die. Get out. And I thought, I was kind of stunned at that. I'm trying to eat my French toast at breakfast, and he just lays that on me. The cities will die. Get out. Now, in his 2014 EMP conference that they held in Delta, Utah, he used more elegant language to phrase that. And during his talk, which you can watch on YouTube, by the way, he said, your chances of finding food and water are much better outside the city. And of course, he went right on with his presentation. Well, I'm sure that statement went right over the heads of most of the people in that room. But sitting across the breakfast table, Braun could be more blunt and just said, the city will die, get out. All right, so that was 2014. In 2016, I wandered into the offices of the West Jordan City water utility, and I'd never been in there before. And I'm just an ordinary taxpayer, I didn't really know who does what in there. And I went up to the receptionist and I said, is it possible for me to speak to one of your civil engineers? And the woman was very polite and said, you just go over there and sit on the sofa and Somebody will be out to see you. So in a couple of minutes, this gray-haired man came out. And I really like gray-haired men and gray-haired women because they know stuff. And we talked for about 40 minutes. And I think for the first 10 minutes, he was trying to kind of feel out who I was to make sure I wasn't there to learn how to sabotage the water system. But after a while, he explained to me that West Jordan gets 82% of its drinking water from the reservoirs above the mountains. Jordanelle, Deer Creek Reservoir. I can't remember the one by Heber. And he said we get 18% of our water from the city wells if we have to use the wells. We don't like to use the wells because when we do, it drags the contaminated aquifer from the Kennecott copper mine operation closer to the city wells, and we don't like that. So they try not to use the wells. And I said, okay, so if we have a 7.5 earthquake on the Wasatch Front, what does that mean for the water system? And he said, well, the water that comes down from the reservoirs passes through miles and miles of 6-foot diameter concrete piping. And the earthquake will probably break up quite a bit of that pipe, and it'll take us 4 to 6 months to repair those concrete pipes. But we can keep the city alive using just the wells, provided that all the wells still work. And of course, we know earthquakes damage well casings quite often. And provided that we can maintain the supply of diesel fuel to the standby generators at the well houses, and providing that no one in the city takes a shower. So we're going to be operating on a razor thin margin of error there in that type of disaster. And so I said, okay, so what if we had an electromagnetic pulse lay down? And he looked straight in my eye and he said, the city will die. Well, I got my answer. And I knew that he knew the answer. And I waited several seconds to see if he would offer a workaround. And he didn't offer a workaround and then he explained why that is. And that is because the generators have no EMP protection for the circuit boards that manage all the functions on this diesel generator. State of the art, it's very EMP compliant as far as emissions controls and everything, but it's loaded with these big circuit cards and they're packed with chips. There is no surge suppression devices on the power line that interconnects with the generators. That's the transfer switches. So he said the generators will fail. Also, the valves, the huge valves that open and close in the Wasatch Front's water system, are all controlled by computers in a master control room. I don't know where that is. And they have, 24 big computer screens up on the wall, and there's 2 or 3 people in there, and they open and close valves by moving a mouse on a computer. They can open valve 157 and they can close 431 from this control room. But those valves no longer have the big manual handles, the wheels on them, so that you can dispatch a worker out into the field to manually open or close a valve. Those are gone. They're all digitally controlled, motor operated valves. And he went on for several minutes on other parts of the system, not to mention all the computer screens would be black because they don't have power. So it's really important, I think, for each of us to consider what we can do as individuals, or several individuals can pool their resources and go in together and work together to solve this vulnerability problem. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have a well, if it's connected to the power grid, it could be damaged or destroyed by the EMP. that well pump has a controller on it that tells the pump when to turn on and when to turn off. If those parts are damaged or destroyed and you don't have spares, then you don't have a well. Now, assuming that you have your 500 gallons or 1,000-gallon reserve of drinking water, that will tide you over while you reinstall your backup water pump and get your well back up and running again, assuming you have a generator that is able to start a 2-3 horsepower well motor, which may be 10 or 15,000 watts. You'll have to check the depth of your well and the horsepower rating on your well pump. Do you have a large supply of fuel to keep that generator running for several years? Because it could be several years. I remember sitting at a luncheon table with Edwin York and Bronson Cotis and Dr. Lowell Wood. All of these people were extremely fluent in EMP issues. And I just threw the question out there, how long would it take for the United States to reconstitute the power grid in the event of an EMP attack if we could communicate with Europe, if we could send a carrier pigeon or somebody in a sailboat over to Europe and ask for spare parts? Because we can't manufacture spare parts because we don't have a power grid. We don't have a supply chain anymore. We have all these workers who can't work, as in my crew at the pharmaceutical company. You know, the lights are off, the place is a cave inside, there are no windows in there. We can't run the machines, we can't do our jobs, we can't manufacture and produce consumables. So we're going to have to rely on foreign sources for all these parts, especially the extreme high voltage transformers that are used at every power plant to put 500,000 volts, 700,000 volts, 1,000,000 volts onto those high voltage transmission lines that you see alongside the highways and all through various areas of the state. So without those high voltage transformers that can weigh up to 700 tons and require a 20 axle trailer to transport, you're not going to get these power plants back online. So those take 1 to 3 years to manufacture. And assuming that somebody will take our credit card after we have zero economy, which I highly doubt, there's all kinds of complex issues that face the recovery. And so I asked the question, how long would it take to restore the US power grid? And these three scientists looked at each other across the table, and I think Ed York spoke first and said 1 to 2 decades. And the other two nodded their heads in agreement. Yeah, 10 to 20 years before the US power grid would be rebuilt. That's a long time to go without water utilities, sewer systems, manufacturing, transportation fuels, communications, medical care. All these things you're going to be on your own with. So I'd be thinking about that. Now, one of the things I learned from Jim Phillips, one of the many things that I learned, if you'll pardon me for a second, was when you engineer your water filtration system, it's important that you don't try to filter everything with one filter element. Okay. And that's what you're dealing with an emergency backpacker type or a drip, Berkey or Aqua Rain filter system. You have one process. And so you're trying to grab, sticks and leaves all the way down to hopefully virus level in one filter operation. And that hopelessly clogs the filter right away with the fine sediment, and you're in trouble. So what you want to do is you want to filter that water in different stages. So I can't see what you can see, but this is an example. Can you see that image, Sharon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we can see it.
Okay. So let's see, to you, it would be bottom left. There's a smaller filter element, and what that is a 90 micron stainless steel mesh pre-filter. And since I've installed that, we like installed it 6 months ago. I'm amazed at how fast that 90 micron screen clogs with sand and sediment. So I may only pump 200 gallons or 100 gallons through there from the stream, and that thing is covered with sand. So I have to stop the operation and back flush that filter. It's got a discharge valve at the bottom you can open, and it back flushes all that sediment out into a bucket, and I close the dump valve and then resume filtering. So that takes all the burden of that coarse sediment off of the next filter. Oh man. Takes all that burden off of the next filter in line, which is a 5 micron filter element. And that element lasts about 15,000 gallons, which is a lot of water. And the filter element's only about $20. So you should have a stack of those in your stuff. And then the next filter that's up higher, that's a 1 micron filter. And that captures all your protozoa, your cysts like Giardia and Cryptosporidium, and a lot of bacteria. Okay, now this is the 120 volt well pump motor that has a capacity of 15 gallons per minute that I use to pull water about 200 feet from the stream. And this over here is a pressure tank, a small pressure tank that I bought at Lowe's for a reasonable price. And so that maintains kind of an even pressure throughout the system. And then I need to go to the next slide. Okay, from left to right, the white thing in line is an inline chlorinator. So we've removed all the junk from 1 micron and larger from the system now, so that the chlorine has a much better chance to attack bacteria and viruses that are still in the water. If you're trying to use chlorine or iodine to disinfect surface water, and it's got all these big particles of dirt and sediment in there, you're not going to kill those pathogens before you drink it, because the pathogens hide inside the dirt and the chemicals can't reach it. Okay, so after the chlorinator, it goes into a retention tank. So the chlorinated water at 2 parts per million chlorine circulates in this retention tank for a couple of minutes before it leaves, and it provides maximum contact time for the chlorine to do its work. And then it leaves the retention tank and goes into what's called a nano filter, and that removes 99.9999% of viruses. And of course, bacteria. Bacteria compared to a virus look like a volleyball and a BB. Okay, so that element really does a highly effective job in protecting you from viruses. After that, we have this big carbon canister, weighs 100 pounds dry weight, and that's usable up to 700,000 gallons. And that recaptures the chlorine that you put in earlier. And it also captures about 4 pages of industrial solvents like MTBE, trichlorofluoroethylene 111, acetone, fertilizers, pesticides, and more importantly, not only fertilizers from nitrates from fertilizers, but nitrates from animal waste. Then you don't want to be drinking that. But your Catadine filter over here doesn't do that. Okay.
We're reaching the end of our hour, and so perhaps you could summarize and then I believe you did write an article for the Journal of Civil Defense about your system,
Okay,
or did you?
I can't remember if I did or not.
I think we've seen that filter before, but we could either include that in one of the upcoming issues, or we can put it uh, on our next issue, I guess, which
Okay,
should be coming up in April. But anyway, yeah, if you could summarize, and then we can, there's been some questions in the chat about, what do we do? And basically, you're describing what to do, but people are going to need more details anyway. So we'll go ahead and get that information for people. We did have a question about the the name of that report that you're reading from. If you could give that to us one more time,
let me hold that up.
and we can put that. Maybe we can provide a link to that or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, report of the commission to assess. Right. Okay. Okay. Here, let me get a picture of that real quick.
It's like 210 pages on the executive summary.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it goes into detail on how the power system works and how they're all interconnected, and
Yeah.
how they have to have space-based satellite systems to coordinate the sine waves between all the power providers, so they're all in the same sine wave.
Yeah.
And they
Mm-hmm.
reference the atomic clock in Fort Collins, Colorado. I mean, this is a very sophisticated system, and after I got through about 80 pages of that, I was surprised the power grid works as it is.
Yeah. Well, they said that, the West German power system worked really quite well, but when they coupled it with the East German, after German reunification, there were a lot of issues. And
I didn't
I think
know that. I never even thought of that.
yeah,
Um, what I'm trying to emphasize, I think, to the listeners is there are a lot of problems that you'll have to deal with, but the number one problem you're going to have to deal with is water. Or perhaps even, well, we can get into cold weather survival another time, but cold, if you don't have good cold weather gear, you'll die in a few hours or minutes even. If you don't have take care of the water situation, you got 2 or 3 days. And you better be able to generate and process all the water you're going to need for the rest of your life, because the utilities are not coming back probably in your lifetime.
Paul, touch on the importance of putting in a hand pump. If you can get a hand pump into your well, and
Yeah,
I think we can even pump almost down to 300 feet.
300 feet. The Amish catalog, Lehman's, sells very good water pumps that, of course, the Amish use lavishly. Also, there are DC powered, solar panel powered pumps that that pump down to like 1,000 feet, but it only uses like a 3/8 inch tube to push the water up to the top. So it's a lot lighter than pushing water up, a 2-inch water line. There's a lot less weight there, but it only gives you a gallon a minute. However, in 10 minutes, that's 10 gallons. In 10 hours, that's 600 gallons. See, so if you have a reservoir to pump that into, a storage tank, one of those DC powered well pumps, it's a great standby you could deploy later, and it's run by a 400-watt solar panel. So there's many options that you can consider, but give that some serious thought, and don't be intimidated by spending $2,000 or $3,000 on resolving this problem. Because when my water main connection went out, it's going to cost $6,000. Okay, yeah, okay, $6,000. Do it, because I want to have water. So, did you have any other questions that you wanted to go through?
Paul, what do you think about collection of rainwater?
That's a really good idea, and that if you live back east or in Hawaii where it rains 148 inches a year, you know, you got a lot of water from rain. But out here,
Mhm.
sometimes it's pretty sparse between good rains. But yeah, if you can capture rainwater, I'm all for it. It's just that other things fall on
Yeah,
your
I mean,
roof besides
yeah,
rain.
we have asphalt roofing and
You can treat
yeah,
you
so you
can
got to
flush it
have
with
some
that.
filtration.
Yeah, there's filters for that.
Yeah. Okay.
And birds tend to they tend to bomb your roof too.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, water is water. I don't
Yeah.
care
Yeah,
what
and
the filters
squirrels get
are.
up there and
Yeah, as long as you use the right filters and don't skimp on filters, because as one manufacturer says,
yeah,
you
we
can
get downpours. So we're in southeast Nebraska, so we
oh
get our
yeah, rain.
thunderstorms and we get a lot of rain at once
Yes, you
sometimes. So
do. Um,
yeah.
I grew up in Missouri, and I never heard of a sprinkling system for lawns in Missouri. It rained all the time.
Oh.
So out here in Utah, where we have 12 inches of annual rainfall, you know,
Yeah.
that could be an issue. But a lot of people have big cisterns, you know, hold 2, 3,000, 5,000 gallons of water, and they fill it with rainwater. Works for me.
Yeah, and we live in a community of about 220 people, and we have a well that's literally the tower's right behind our house. We've got a propane generator out there that they've hooked up because we all have propane bombs in our backyards,
That's okay.
for our heating.
Energy is
So
energy. Yeah.
yeah, so that's another issue I worry about with, like even having a nuclear blast, having that thing in my backyard and, having to disconnect things in the house and stuff if something like that happens or, it's just another thing to talk about another time. But so.
Jay's our mechanical engineer here. Jay, how do big urban water towers fare in a tornado? I've never seen one get hit.
You know, I think they actually do fairly good in tornadoes. They're well, maybe not a tornado, or at least that they're probably designed for maybe 150-mile-an-hour winds. I guess a direct hit from a tornado might actually
Well, they're
tip
pretty
over.
heavy.
Yeah,
They're pretty heavy and pretty solid. So
yeah, they're
Yeah.
very solid. So may or may not survive, I guess.
And propane doesn't have to be, it may not be the problem that we're thinking because propane is already under pressure. And so that high pressure from a nuclear weapon, if you're under pressure, is going to bypass a high pressure tank. And
Okay.
it may not be, it may not be the issue, but it gives you a little comfort.
well,
Yeah, that's good to know.
there's translational displacement of that large propane tank by the dynamic winds. So
Right, hopefully it's on the ground, stationed good on the ground.
Hey, so we had a tornado that came through about 2-3 years ago, and it was an EF4, and it narrowly missed our house, but it hit the water tower at the top of the hill pretty much dead on, and it didn't take it down.
wow. Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
Huh. Good deal.
I never thought about
Cool.
tornadoes and water towers before, but you know, when I was a little kid riding in my parents' car, I was going down the highway, I had nothing else to do but look at the power lines and the water towers and wonder how does that work? And so
Yeah.
stuff like this, this report teaches me how things work. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're reaching the end of our allowable time here, so I guess we'll have to cut it off now. But I would just suggest that everyone watch the Journal of Civil Defense, and we'll try to maybe cover these things. I've thought of a few good subjects that we might cover with some future articles, and I'm relatively sure that Paul has actually detailed some the details of his water filtration system there. So anyway, we'll make sure and get that information out to everyone, the detailed information that you really need. So anyway, thank you for your time, Paul, and your preparation. And thank you for everyone else for attending. And we will go ahead and close our meeting now and wish you all good night. And and invite you to come back next month, and we'll be sending out the messages as usual. So thank you very much.
Okay. Be safe.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.